But this really marks the end of a major section of Deuteronomy. I talked in times past about how Deuteronomy follows the design of the covenant, the ancient covenant documents, which would have this introduction and a historical prologue, a set of commandments, followed by sanctions. What happens if you keep the covenant? What happens if you break the covenant? And then covenant succession. It was a treaty form between vassals and kings in ancient times that they've seen in many manuscripts. And the book of Deuteronomy is set up that way. God introduces himself as the Lord, the king, and we are the vassal. We are the people that he's redeemed out of Egypt. And it gives history for about till chapter 4. It gives the history of how they came to be where they are this particular day. Moses is reiterating the covenant before he dies. And these are spoken in the final days of Moses' life, is the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the English word for second giving of the law, second law. And so now, after the historical prologue, you start in chapter 5 with the Ten Commandments. And we've gone through many case laws and many commandments that are, this is what we're to do as the people under the king. These are the commandments that we're to obey. We're coming to the end of that tonight in chapter 26. So we've been going rather slowly through the last 10, 15 chapters in particular, because we've been getting into the individual case laws and their application. But we've really turned a corner with chapter 26. Starting in chapter 27, we're going to have the blessings and the curses for obedience and disobedience. And even this chapter ends with, it's kind of the summary statement of the section of Deuteronomy that deals with the laws that we are to obey. So let me go ahead and just read through the whole chapter, and then hopefully my slides will get up here in a little bit. We're having technical difficulties, so I don't have them up for you yet. Sam's working on that. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and have taken possession of it and live in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground which you harvest from your land, that the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall put it in a basket, and you shall go to the place that the Lord your God will choose, to make his name to dwell there. And you shall go to the priest who is in the office at the time, and say to him, I declare to you today, to the Lord your God, that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give us. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God. And you shall make response before the Lord your God. Now, I want you to take notice of this. Something pretty unusual in this chapter, and this is a kind of a liturgy. You've got this is what you will say, and it's pre-written for them what they will say. And so in verse 5 it says, and you shall make response before the Lord your God. Quote, a wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly, and humiliated us, and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror and signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. And so that's the end of the quote. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God, and worship before the Lord your God. And you shall rejoice in all the good that the Lord your God has given to you in your house, you and the Levite and the sojourner who is among you. When you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the 3rd year, which is the year of tithing, giving it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your towns and be filled, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion out of my house, and moreover I have given it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandment that you have commanded me. I have not transgressed any of your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. I have not eaten of the tithe while I was mourning, or removed any of it while I was unclean, or offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord my God. I have done according to all that you have commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation from prayer from heaven, and bless your people Israel, and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and rules. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart, with all your soul. You have declared today that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in his ways, and keep his statutes and his commandments and his rules, and will obey his voice. And the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession, as he has promised you, and that you are to keep all his commandments, and that he will set you in praise and in fame and in honor high above all nations that he has made, and that you shall be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised. That's the summary statement, the end of the case laws, if you even want to call these case laws. It deals with this chapter deals with first fruits, and it deals with the poor tithe that happened every 3 years. And what I found particularly interesting in this chapter is he says, this is what you will say. Now there's another time at Passover when they were told to say certain things. There's like an order of service. In fact, the word Seder, I think, means order of service, in which they would say particular things. Like on Passover, the children would say, Lord, why is this night, or Dad, why is this night different than all other nights? And he would say, well, this night is the night the Lord our God brought us up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and would go through this recitation that God prescribes, this is what you shall say. So it becomes, whether they would read it or memorize it, probably a very memorized piece of scripture, because they were to say it every year at first fruits. When is first fruits? Yes, it is. It is around Passover. I have a screenshot from Leviticus 23. So in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, is Passover. And the day after Passover would be a Sabbath. And then you'd have the weekly Sabbath. It might be the same day, because Passover would hit different days of the week. The day immediately following the weekly Sabbath was the first day of the week, and that was first fruits during the feast of Passover. So it's actually part of the larger feast of unleavened bread. And here's why it's significant. What happened on first fruits the year Jesus died and rose again? What event? Anybody know?
That was the resurrection.
Yes, it was the resurrection. Jesus was crucified on Passover. At the time they're sacrificing the temple lambs, Jesus is giving up the ghost, right? He's being crucified. And on the very day, which was the first day of the week, it was always the first day of the week. It was always the day after the Sabbath. So God prescribed it to be the first day of the week. Jesus rises from the grave on the first day of the week. Some words call the 8th day, because it's the day after the 7th. It's a new beginning, right? Jesus raises from the dead on the first day of the week, which is also first fruits. What do they do on first fruits? Well, that was the day when they made their trip to Jerusalem in the spring. They bring the first fruits of their crop, and it's holy to the Lord. The very first thing they get is holy to the Lord, and they bring it to the temple, and they go through. They lay it up before the Lord, and they go through this little service, and we're given the liturgy of what they say. So let's look again at what it says. So this would take place on the day that Jesus would eventually rise from the dead, and they would wave. It doesn't say it here, but they would wave the grain offering before the Lord. It's really called a heave offering, meaning to lift up. So Jesus rose from the grave on the day when they lift up the grain offering. Remember, Jesus gave the illustration. I believe it's in Matthew. He says, except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it falls on the ground and dies, it brings forth much fruit. It's just interesting because at Passover, they would bring their first fruits of grain, and they would take the sheaf and they would rise it up before the Lord. There's a lot of passages we could look at, but if I don't have my slides tonight, we won't be able to. 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about how Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead. And that's really important because what they were saying in a sense is this is our first, for the first month of the year, our first harvest, we're bringing our very first and our best to the Lord. And it was the picture is that if you dedicate the first fruits to the Lord, the whole year is holy. If you sanctify the whole year by giving your first to God, God blesses the rest of the year. And it's a picture that also we expect God to fulfill his promises and give us a fruitful harvest for the remainder of the year. So in the spring, they're even looking forward to the summer Pentecost harvest, also Harvest Festival. Pentecost falls on it 50 days later. And then in the fall, you have the Fall Feast and the Feast of Trumpets. And it's interesting, I've been reading through Corinthians with my family, and we read through chapter 16 last night, and we read through 15 the night before. And 15 is the great resurrection chapter, and it refers to Jesus, the first fruits of the dead. Paul is making an allusion to this feast when they would lift up the grain offering, and that's when Jesus rose from the grave. And he makes the point that he ties it to the harvest at the end of the year with the resurrection. If you read the rest of the chapter, he ties the final harvest and the blowing of trumpets, because in the feast, he talks about how the Lord will descend with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and blow the trumpet. That happens in the fall. They have the Feast of Trumpets. In fact, last year at the camp out, not this year, but the year before, our camp out on that Sunday, that evening, began. They say today Rosh Hashanah, but that's not the biblical term. The biblical term is Yom Teruah. Rosh Hashanah means head of the year. The biblical term is Day of Blasting, Feast of Trumpets. And many people believe that the Lord will return someday in the future on a Feast of Trumpets, because Paul makes an allusion to the first fruits feast when Jesus rose from the grave. And in the same chapter of 1 Corinthians 15, he refers to the day when he descends on the last trumpet is blown, and the Lord descends with the trumpet, and the resurrection of our bodies. So the first fruits is a picture of the final harvest. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we also have confidence that we will rise from the dead, and we will get new bodies, and we will ever be with the Lord when God blows the final trumpet. So these feasts are a picture of the great acts of redemption in history. Christ was tabernacled in flesh. He was crucified on Passover. He rose from the grave on first fruits. He sent the Holy Spirit at the great harvest festival on Pentecost. And when he descends, he will descend with the blast of a trumpet. And if you look in the book of Revelation, it refers to, there's lots of language, particularly in the Greek, referring to his tabernacling with men. And palm trees and lots of imagery. This is why usually when we have our fall camp out, every year I try to talk about something from these many passages from the New Testament and the Old Testament about the fall feast. I did something different this year, but most years I focus on it because there's a lot of scripture that remains close to us if we don't understand the biblical feasts and how they tie in. And on Wednesday nights, we've covered it quite a lot. We've gone through it again and again, but it's hard to remember these things, and that's why Israel every year in first fruits, they would go through this liturgy in which God prescribes what to say. So let's look at it again, and if anybody wants to interrupt for any reason, I'm going to take my glasses on and off because otherwise I can't read. And I can't see you without the glasses. Okay, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and have taken possession of it and live in it. All right, so remember, Moses is about to die. He's never gone into the promised land. This is written when they're on the other side of Jordan. So he's about to die. Joshua's going to take over, and he's actually, the children of Israel are actually going to celebrate Passover when they cross over to the land for the first time. The beginning of the year, the beginning of the conquest. Okay, so verse 2. You shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from your land that the Lord your God has given you, and you shall put it in a basket, and you shall go to the place that the Lord your God will choose and make his name to dwell there. Even on Sunday, when I was going through Exodus 20, he uses the same phrase, the place where he will dwell and his name will dwell. That's in reference to the tabernacle that is in the future yet to be set up. Actually, no, they have the tabernacle set up in the wilderness, but it's going to change. It's going to go through them into the promised land, and then eventually it's going to be the temple, and then eventually it's going to be Jesus. But that's where God's name dwells. So he says, you're going to take a basket, you're going to go to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name to dwell there. And you shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, I declare today to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give us. So that's the first thing that they are to say. They're prescribed what to say. They're prescribed to say that God basically has been faithful to his promise and has done what he said he was going to do. It's a confession of faith. And an affirmation that it's true that God keeps his word. Verse 4, then the priest shall take the basket from their hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God. Now this is when the response gets really interesting. This is the longest dialogue, but I think it's interesting what is recalled here, and I want to think through it a little bit. And you shall make response before Yahweh Elohim. A wandering Aramean was my father. Now, do you think that's flattering? A wandering Aramean was my father? Meaning from Aram, from kind of a Hebrew on the other side of the river, an Aramean. My father was a wandering Aramean. This is a humbling statement. This is the opposite of racial pride. He says, my father was, he's not saying, oh, my great father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a humble statement that without God, my father was a wandering Aramean. Not some great, significant, doesn't focus on the greatness of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. Instead, focuses on the fact that Jacob is called an Aramean. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number. And there he became a great nation, great, mighty,